Martha.
Um,
Okay.
okay,
Excuse me.
Kevin, teach us, my dear friend.
So this is going to be dedicated for the success in the mission of the soldiers of the armed forces of Israel to destroy the enemy and return the hostages safely, and for them to return safely, and also for Shlema, for Leah Bat Yerachmiel, and for Yerachmiel ben Chana.
Amen.
Okay. So I was listening to a share today, a talk by a very fantastic Rov, who's actually a historian by the name of Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. He's based at JLE in London. He's got a whole amazing history series. And when I went for my walk, I was listening to one of the first part about the spiritual roots and historical significance of Yishmael. And the Bnei Yishmael, the name Yishmael means to cry out. So they take their prayer very seriously, and they take certain things like Brit Milah, certain things they do very seriously, and they try to do it to the letter of the law, and that gives them strength. And in these times, for us to help our nation, and especially the captives and other people that in our prayers, certain things in the Shemona Esrei, we should try focus on and try have kavanah with. So the one thing that I took back today was in the Shemona Esrei, there's I'll say it in Hebrew, then I'll say it in English. It's called redemption. So I'll say it in Hebrew. It says Re'eva Nenu, Riva Rivenu, Ugalenu Meira, Naman Shmecha, Ki Goel Chazak Ata Baruch Ata Shem Goel Yisrael. And then it says in English, behold our affliction, take up our grievance and redeem us speedily for your name's sake, for you are a powerful redeemer. Blessed are you, Hashem, redeemer of Yisrael. So because they are hostages that need to be redeemed or saved, when we say that, we should, and I'm talking to myself also, try to keep in mind the hostages and that they should be released speedily. And when we say that in the Shemona Esrei, try focus on the meaning of that and the actual, what we can actually relate to it at this current time. So that's and that will give us strength to combat the power that Ishmael has. If we have kavanah in certain things, and especially something like that, if possible, it'll make it more stronger with our davening, and it can match the praying of Bnei Yishmael.
What do you want to eat? You're on camera now.
You see it there, Damon, in the art scroll.
We don't just want you Mac, we want you to pass it.
Well, you blurred, but you're on camera.
So it's on page 183, 103.
Just hang on, Kevin. I
102.
want to also bring something else to your attention, and Arthur's. If you look at the art scroll on page 234, for example, it's in every Shemona is shown Mincha. Okay, you've got Machalkel Chaim B'Chesed Mechiyeh Metim B'Rachamim Rabim Someach Noflim V'Refchei Cholim Tirashim Kim Tar Lishnei Afar Mi Chamocha Ba'al Kavod U'Mitu Melach Melech Mit Mechayeh U'Matzmiach Yeshua. It says, listen to this: who sustains the living with kindness, revives the dead with abundant mercies. Now, at this point, it says, Kevin, supports the fallen, heals the sick, releases the bound. And I remember that Ron Juton said that's the davening that one says also releases the bound and supports the fallen. That's also what you have to say in terms of honor for the captives and those that soldiers that have fallen, that they can end up not being mortally, just temporarily injured. So you're 100% on the mark. There are many places in the davening. Well done, kid. We need to bear that in mind. And what did you say that rabbi's name is?
Aubrey Hirsch, he's brilliant. He's at the
Aubrey Hirsch.
JLE in London. Brilliant, like a photographic memory and it's like a Talmud Chochem. He's very close to Rabbi Tetz, and you'll find. I'll show you one day the podcasts, and you have to subscribe to Spotify. A lot of free, and that's I've listened to a lot of his historical talks.
Okay,
So it's fantastic.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So we're on the 114th daf, which is great. Please God, 5 dafs left, and we're done. So well done, guys. We're not going to put you through a big Gemara. We're going to go to Makot, where it's very short book next, hopefully. And it won't take long. All right, so guys, we're dealing with another case in which a Jew is excommunicated for harming another Jew. So the first case that we dealt with was when you were dealing with a Jew that supported as a witness a fellow Kuthian or Kuti against a Jewish defendant. And we say that because in a non-Jewish legal standpoint, particularly in a magistrate's court, not in a high court, is deemed as a one witness having the power to testify against the defendant and win, he's causing that Jew a loss. Whereas in a Jewish court, you need 2 witnesses, and that Jew on his own wouldn't have created that monetary loss. So in that particular case, he's responsible and he's excommunicated until he pays the debt of the Jew that he cost money to. However, a Jew can testify in a high court of a secular court because they work on needing 2 witnesses, the same as a Jewish court, and 1 witness is only there to force the defendant to have to take an oath to prove his innocence using Hashem's name, which is the same methodology used in the Jewish court, and therefore he wouldn't have cost the Jew any money because it would have his testimony alone would not have convicted that other Jew. It would just allow that other Jew to convict himself if he wasn't prepared to take the oath. And then the whole question is, what happens if somebody is very distinguished? Because in a in a non-Jewish court, like a government court, they can exact his money on his word alone, meaning that even in a higher non-Jewish court, they see his word as if it had the merit of 2 people. So should he not testify before them? Or perhaps we say that since he's distinguished, he can't evade them, and therefore he has to testify. The Gemara said, let it stand unresolved. That's how we ended off yesterday. So we're saying that this is another case that we're going to learn today when a Jew is excommunicated for harming another Jew. And Rav Ashi said, this Jew who sold an idolater land that borders on land belonging to his fellow Jew, we excommunicate him. So in other words, what's the situation? Well, basically, if you want to seek a reason for the law, if you say that he actually is deserving of such punishment because he violated the law of an adjoining property owner, but Master said, Master is obviously the Tanna Kamma who wrote this Mishnah, if one buys from an idolater or sells to an idolater, the sale is not subject to the law of the adjoining property owner. So what is this whole law? So in order to get a bit of clarity over this, you've got to go for an issue of this law of adjoining property ownership. So basically it provides the fact that when land is put up for sale, the owner of the adjacent property has first rights over anybody else to buy it. Now, getting that first right does not mean that he can give a ridiculous offer to purchase it, because the one selling it doesn't have to lose financially. You're only saying that give him a first entitlement to make the purchase of your buying price. And if anybody is able to beat it and offer a higher price, this is my question: are you allowed to sell it for a higher price? And it would seem no. That once you set the market-related rate, your neighbor has first priority to buy it. I wonder though, and this is what I want to try and see if Rabbi Cohen would know, if somebody that's not your next door neighbor offered you much higher rate than and he's also favored you than the neighbor, are you allowed to take financial precedence over your adjoining neighbor if the price that is being offered is far more than market related? Anyway, so we are saying, assuming nobody's prepared to pay more than market related rate, his neighbor has got first dibs over anybody else to buy it. So it was a rabbinic enactment based on the Torah's commandment in Devarim, which is Deuteronomy, specifically in chapter 6, verse 18. And it says, you shall do that which is right and good, which obligates one person to benefit another, even beyond the letter of the law, if you will not suffer a significant loss by doing so. Okay, so therefore, I've just answered my own question, because according to that opinion, as long as he does not suffer a loss. So therefore, if he can get a higher price, I think that would be the dominant factor. All things being equal, as to give his neighbor first priority in terms of offer to purchase. So the owner of the neighboring property would certainly benefit from purchasing the land next to his. Okay. And why do you think that is, guys?
It extends his
Well, it's
property.
logical, Damon. Because he can expand his property and make it bigger and worth more. He doesn't have panel for to do anything. It's out there.
Yeah. And in fact, they use a legal term here. I actually misread it when I read it last week, because it basically it said exactly what Arthur and Gavin had said, so that the benefit is having contiguous fields, and that reduces the cost of labor and security, amongst other advantages. Now, I thought it said the word continuous fields. So what is contiguous? It's interesting. It's a legal term. It's an adjective for sharing a common border. In other words, it says in the dictionary, next to or a sequence. So I don't know where the word contiguous comes from continuous, because it sounds to me very, very similar in meaning, even in spelling. But basically what you're able to do is reduce logistical costs, because if you're able to go from one field to another, you can carry on your agricultural benefit, where you wouldn't have to separate fields and then go to another field further away, water it, take the tractor, take labor, and spend a lot of wasted time. And then also from an animal husbandry point of view, you could end up having a larger ranch, keeping different animals there appropriately. So it obviously has a lot of benefits. But
can I just add a comment?
Of course.
I'll give you a good word. You can share infrastructure, and that's the biggest thing, because it's exactly what you're saying, but an extension of that. So you can share your entire infrastructure, like your tractors that you use in the one field, you can just use them in the other field. You have to go buy new ones. If it's further down, you might have to buy other ones. You might have to buy other equipment. You also got one farmhouse, as opposed to having two, all that type of stuff. So the infrastructure can be shared, which is a huge saving.
Yeah.
And labor. You can possibly share labor. You can have one ranch manager as opposed to having two, that type of thing.
I think Gavin said it much more succinctly, because it says in Bava Kamma in the 108th daf that the minute you have two separate properties, you think it's just a minor schlep, but it's not a minor schlep. You're having to buy two of everything, especially if it's at a distant place, because instead of building one larger farmhouse, exactly that, where all your staff are residing, because agricultural and animal husbandry staff stay on the property, you're now having to build two separate buildings, and your cost isn't with room extensions. It's actually with building a completely new infrastructure, double the amount of equipment, double the amount of management to oversee properties instead of just going there. And exactly also, as Gavin said, that somebody that buys the land can just buy somewhere else. It's not going to inconvenience them, but the neighbor does, for sure. So what's this issue?
What happens if there's two neighbors? Because there could be, and then what? Who gets it? That'll be interesting.
Yeah, it actually is interesting. I'm assuming the one that would get it would be the one that's prepared to offer more, because you don't have
Either
to
that,
financially
the one that
purchase
offers
yourself.
more, yeah. So it will become a bidding contest. I also think that.
Yeah. So we're saying, what's the reason for the law? So in other words, Rav Ashi said, the Jew who sold an idolater land that borders on land belonging to his fellow Jew, we excommunicate him. And what's the reason for the law? If you say that he's deserving of such punishment because you're violating this law of adjoining property owner, but Master has said, if one buys from an idolater or sells to an idolater, the sale is not subject to the law of the adjoining property owner. So if you want to know why, because it sounds like it should actually make a difference. So this was an interesting commentary by Rashi. And the Nimukei Yosef, it says, when one buys land from an idolater, the law of the adjoining property owner is not applicable, because the whole purpose of that law is to protect the interests of the neighbor. And the buyer can claim he already accomplished that by removing the idolater from the neighbor's border. So the neighbor cannot contend that he too could have gotten rid of the property of its harmful owner by purchasing the land himself, because it's possible that had this buyer refrained from purchasing the land and given the neighbor a chance to buy it, the owner would have sold it to another idolater in the interim. So when one sells land to an idolater, the law of the adjoining property doesn't apply either. Why? Because the law doesn't place any obligation upon the seller. This is the interesting part. Because he doesn't harm his neighbor by selling the field to another party. In other words, the neighbor is no worse off than if the field had not been sold, since either way, he wouldn't own the adjoining field. Meaning, if I owned a field and I was going to sell it to Gavin, and instead of selling it to Gavin, who's my next door neighbor, I sold it to another Jew, Gavin would be harmed. But because a non-Jew is not under the law of going above and beyond the law in order to make sure Gavin got the adjoining property, if I sold it to an idolater, I wouldn't be obligated. The only time there's an obligation to give Gavin first preference is if I sold it to another Jew. And then the law is you might as well be kinder to the Jew that's your next door neighbor than a strange Jew. So that law doesn't apply. Okay, so in other words, the weird thing is here is the obligation of the law falls only upon the buyer, who must forego his purchase of the field for the sake of the neighbor. In other words, if the buyer is an idolater who is not obligated to keep the law of the adjoining property, the neighbor has no claim on the land. Now, I don't quite understand why the obligation is on the buyer as opposed to the seller. So I need to ask Rabbi Cohen there. But in any event, let's just go what the Gemara answers is. It's just saying that this law as far as adjoining property owner is not the reason why the Gemara has a problem with you selling to an idolater. And we excommunicate the Jew for doing it. It says the reason is that the adjoining property owner can say to the seller, you've placed a line at my border. In other words, you've potentially subjected me to harm. Because idolaters are not obligated to follow the Jewish laws that regulate behavior between neighbors, they've got a different moral ethic. The requirements to create a distance, like, for example, if an idolater is allowed to keep dangerous animals because he doesn't submit to Torah law. Because the Torah law says you can't keep a dangerous animal because those sort of hazards can escape. And the requirement to respect a neighbor's property, etc., could put the neighbor at risk. Not only the wild animals, but also the sort of security. In other words, an idolater is not going to keep to any normal ethical law, and his neighbor is in danger. That's the problem. It's not that he sold, he didn't give him the opportunity to buy. because if you sell it to a non-Jew, there's no issue. It's only if you sell it to another Jew that your neighbor has first dibs on it, because he has to be prioritized. Therefore, we excommunicate the seller until he accepts upon himself to pay compensation for any harm that might result from the new owner. So basically, guys, the Gemara implies that the seller must pay compensation only if he accepted upon himself to do so. Otherwise, he wouldn't be liable, because he actually caused the damage with groma, which is indirect damage. So the law stated in the Gemara is limited to a case, for example, where a Jew was willing to match the idolater's offer, or maybe pay the property's fair market value. Okay, so the ban covers all forms of real estate, including houses. So we say if the idolater was able to offer more, then the Jew can't complain. But if he was able to match a fair market price, then it's not a problem. But there seems to be a discrepancy here, because you've got the opinion of the Rosh and Rabbeinu Yonasan, and then you've got the Shitei Kubetzes. So the one says, look, he has to match the idolater's offer, and the other one says the Jew has to reach the market-related price, which is fair. And they're two different things, because what happens if the idolater is prepared to pay far more? Does that mean that the Jew is obligated to do the fair market-related price, and he has to lose money with the idolater? Or does it mean that he sold it to the idolater despite the fact that he was able to match the higher than market-related price of the idolater? So there seems to be a bit of disagreement, but it doesn't seem to mean that the joining property that should go to the neighbor kicks into play when you're selling it to a non-Jew. Only if you're selling it to a fellow Jew, you give your neighbor the advantage first. Personally, it doesn't make sense, but at least they have a constraint where it's saying if you sell it to a non-Jew and he doesn't adhere to moral code, you're going to have drama with the neighbor, but only if you took it onto yourself to be responsible. But who's going to take on that responsibility? I don't know. I honestly don't know. So it doesn't make sense as far as that's concerned. Now, we've got the new Mishnah and we've got the new Gemara. I'm just wondering, because if we how long have we got left, guys? About 20 minutes.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question.
Yeah, sure.
You were saying, or you said, that one shouldn't sell to an idolater. It's permissible.
No, you should not, because we excommunicate the person. And the reason why
idolater who's a Jew or idolater who's a non-Jew?
No. Well, idolaters, the Jew, will get the death penalty, so you can't sell it to him. He's going to be dead. We're talking about there's either a Jew or an idolater. A non-Jew who practices idolatry. Any Jew that practices idolatry gets the death penalty. So you wouldn't be able to sell it to him because he's not going to have a long life expectancy. So what we are saying is, Kevin, I'm placing danger. If I sell let's just put it in, I'm going to, let me just pause the recording now a second for a reason. So Arthur is going to, because he's the one most vulnerable in Eretz Israel, Arthur's the one that's going to read the Mishnah tonight, and I'll just do an overview of the Mishnah, and then we'll read it quickly on Saturday night and go straight into the Gemara. But I can explain the Mishnah. Let me just share the screen. Okay, Arth. Would you like to read it slowly and clearly, my dear friend?
Well, I am very slow, so I'll try to read it clearly. Okay. Let's see. Something happened there. Okay, there we go. If customs collectors confiscated somebody or someone's donkey and gave him another donkey, or if bandits confiscated his garment and gave him another garment, they are his. Because it may be assumed that their owners have despaired of retrieving them. In the case of one who rescues things from a river, or from a troop, or from bandits, if it is known that the owners have despaired of retrieving them, they are his. Similarly, should one find a swarm of bees, if it is known that the owner has despaired of retrieving them, they are his. Rav Yochanan ben Baraka said, a woman or a miner is believed to say, the swarm emerged from here, and one may walk in the midst of his fellow's field to save his swarm of bees. But if he thereby damaged the field, he must pay for what he damaged. However, he may not cut off a branch of his fellow's tree with intent to pay compensation. Rav Ishmael, the son of Rav Yochanan ben Baraka, said, he may even cut off the branch of his fellow's tree and then pay compensation.
Excellent. So the first thing is, let me just give you the concept is, what do you mean if you've got a tax collector or a customs collector that confiscated somebody's donkey and gave him another donkey? Why confiscate it if you're going to give him another donkey? So let me just, or he confiscated his clothes and gave him another other clothes. It's like, what's the point of it? Because it may assume that the owners have despaired of retrieving them. So let me just explain to you what that actually means, guys. Is that we're talking in a case here where you've got a tax collector and the person has, let me just put it in modern terms. The guy's got a Ferrari, okay? Oak's got a Ferrari. So the tax collector is corrupt, and he should technically take the equivalent of a Ford motor car. But the guy's got it to Ferrari, says, listen, I've got 10 guys, we'll crack up in your skull. You owe taxes to the king. I'm an official collector, so I'm taking your Ferrari. Then he takes the Ferrari, but in order to ease his conscience, he gives the other guy a Ford Escort that he already collected for tax from a neighbor in a different suburb. In other words, he's going around town collecting taxes and collecting different cars, because a tax collector's got a car dealership. But he feels sorry and bad for the one that he took a Ferrari from, because actually he should only have taken something, the equivalent of taxes for the Ford Escort. So he kind of wanted to dull his conscience. So he said, all right, yeah, let me give you a second-hand Ford Escort because you need to get from A to B. So all of a sudden he doesn't feel bad about stealing a Ferrari's worth. This is a tax collector where we said we can assure it was stolen because he's basically charging far more than the king or the government would regulate for taxes, and there's very little you can do about it because he's like a mafia boss and he's got a lot of henchmen around him. So that's what we're saying in terms of the garment for another garment. He confiscates a superior item and gives him an inferior item because he feels bad. So you're saying you can't use that, or can you use that? In other words, since he stole your car from you, if he gives you a second-hand Ford Escort, are you not allowed to use it? Because just like he stole from you, he stole that Ford Escort from another person. And the Gemara, the Mishnah says, no, you can, because it can be assumed that the owners have despaired of retrieving them. How do you know the owners have despaired of retrieving them? Well, if the guy's got 20 henchmen that are armed and has permission from the king, although the king doesn't exactly care what's going on or know what's going on, you probably know that you're not going to get your car back. And therefore, if there's Yush and a change of domain, then you can rest assured that you probably could keep it. However, this Mishnah has got a slight contradiction to the previous Mishnah, because the previous Mishnah says, according to Rashi, that you don't keep it because it's repugnant of you as a Jew to derive benefit from something that was stolen from another person. So we are saying it's here, and the previous Mishnah said, well, maybe there was Yush that took place, maybe despair didn't take place, and a change of acquisition. So the same argument is coming here, but it seems to say that because there's despair, you can keep that second-hand inferior item. However, there has to be a suffix as to whether the money is definitely stolen or not. Meaning, if the king hasn't really objected and he hasn't lost his authority by the king, or he collects some tax that's legitimate and some that's over the top, and you don't quite know. So that's the one aspect to bear in mind. The other aspect is it's focusing on this case of what's this thing about bees? So if you find a swarm of bees and the owner having despaired of retrieving them, they're his. So we're saying that the bees all flew to the neighbor's jacaranda tree and they're all pollinating there, and it's unlikely that he'll get his bees back in that particular, because he doesn't know what farm they've gone to, and there's a jacaranda farm next door. So generally, if it's in a public park and all those bees have gone to a public park or whatever, it's difficult to know what to do. But if there's a woman or a miner and they say, listen, this swarm emerged from this private property, we are to believe them. Now, this part of the shir isn't really politically correct because women and miners can't testify in court. Their opinion is not believed because they are, according to the Gemara, how do you say this without being banned? In a way, kind of like forbidden to give testimony because women are emotionally swayed and you can't trust their level of reasoning. And minors, you can't trust their level of reasoning because most teenagers can't be trusted. Okay, so I don't feel like toxic masculinity messages. That's why we post no messages on the group. So in this case, a woman and minor is to be believed because they've got no predisposed prejudice. They're just why? One of the reasons is they don't have to go to court to say it. It was a conversation that a woman or a minor had saying, did you see these came from this particular property and they all swarmed here, meaning that they never conjured testimony before the court. It was a conversation that was heard, so therefore you can believe them. And this whole issue about cutting your fellow's branch with intent to pay compensation, as we're saying, in that particular case, you have bees that create honey, and that honey is worth a lot of money. So are you allowed to cut your neighbor's branch in order to get all the bees back? Because if you grab one bee, you might disturb them all and they fly away. But if they've obviously built a honeycomb and nest and they're residing in the beehive on this new branch, and you cut the branch off gently, you can take it back to your abode and rescue your bees. Are you allowed to do this, but you're damaging the other neighbor's property, and you're compensating him? And the rabbis say that you're not allowed to, but Rav Yishmael, the son of Rav Yochanan ben Baruch, says you can, but you must pay compensation. So we learned this before. We said, what happens if you have a more expensive item, like wine that somebody rescues? Do you entitled to compensation if you put throw away a lower value item like cold drink? Like, in other words, Kevin's got wine and his container's leaking. I've got 2 liters Coke. If I empty the Coke to take Kevin's expensive, let's rather use the word blue label whiskey to put it in before his bottle leaks, am I entitled to compensation from Kevin for the Coca-Cola emptied in order to put in his blue label scotch? Or am I not? Is it just something I must absorb the cost? So we did deal with this before. All right, guys, we've got 2 minutes left. I wish you a wonderful Shabbos. Come back on the camera off for our log off.
So just repeat that last point, please.
So, Kevin, you've got blue label whiskey that's very expensive, but your bottle's leaking for some reason. If I don't quickly empty my 2 liters of Coke and pour your whiskey into my Coke bottle, you're going to lose the value of thousands of rand instead of 40 rand for the Coca-Cola. So are you entitled to compensate me for that Coca-Cola if I did it immediately to stop your loss? Are you entitled to do that without, or am I not entitled to compensation because it was my decision? So that's this whole
No,
issue of
don't
the
just
beach.
back to the other one before with the honey and the wine.
Yeah. So we're gonna. It's the Duff's gonna review that, and it's also gonna
Okay.
review the Duff on page 66. So part of this Duff is a review of the 66th Duff of Bava Kamma with Tara and Tuma, intent, tinsel, robber, thief. We've been through this. This is a bit of a repeat. It's going to make the stuff a lot easier. Guys, have a wonderful Shabbos.
Yeah, you too.
Nice.
Arth, have a
Cheers,
good
cheers.
Shabbos, mate. Ciao.
Ciao, guys.